We have the honor to have with us today Don Miguel Ruiz. He wrote the #1 bestseller, A Practical Guide to Personal Freedom, The Four Agreements. The Four Agreements, a Toltec wisdom book. Miguel was just telling me that while the book was for 7 years on the New York Times bestseller list, it has returned 20 years later and is now on the New York Times bestseller list, the #1 book in the spiritual category. So this is a book that has remained with people for many, many years and continues to hold wisdom that offers us practical ways of acting in the world that offers personal freedom to us, but also, I think, lessons of leadership, of ways of acting in the world that help us to be more powerful leaders. Miguel, thank you so much for joining the Bregman Leadership Podcast. Thank you. So let's start with what led you. There's an experience that led you to discover these agreements and to decide to share the wisdom, the Toltec wisdom, more broadly. Could you briefly share that experience? And a little later on in this podcast, in this conversation, I want to talk about that very particular point because, from a communication standpoint, I think you do that brilliantly, that you write a book that can really appeal to a very broad group of people, no matter the education, no matter the previous knowledge, in a way that touches people. So I want to talk in a minute about how you went about that process. Before I do, let's talk about the book itself. And you start by talking about the problem that requires that we have these four agreements. And that problem has to do with what you call the domestication of humans. Can you talk just a brief amount about that? And as a parent myself, it comes from a good place, right? That I know that like I read that and I think to myself, I'm doing the same thing to my children. I'm trying to teach them what I know. But what you're saying is by doing that, we're also programming them in a way that's based in our culture, that's based in our history, that's based in our ancestors, and that doesn't necessarily always serve us. And when you say domesticate, is it the same thing as educate? Is there what's the difference between domesticate and educate? Mm-hmm. And when you're a young child, when you're 2, 3, 4 years old, that's a life or death issue. Meaning, if I withdraw my love for my child, and they need that in order to survive, so it's not just a an opinion with that comes along with a punishment or a reward. It's really a life or death issue. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's and that and that and that becomes very limiting because we are then controlled by what we imagine are the perceptions of other people, and we lose our ability to be creative, and we lose our ability to express ourselves clearly, and we lose the self-confidence in who we naturally are. We hide that, we separate ourselves from that more and more, so that we show up as a mirror of what the other people around us expect us to be versus what we really think and feel and how we really want to act. Am I understanding that correctly? So one more one more quick question before we get into the agreements, because it occurs to me as I'm listening to you that there's a part of me that feels like it actually serves me to be very aware of what it is that you want and how to meet your expectations, because I could succeed in life by becoming who you need me to be. And that if I'm who you need me to be, whether it's a broad audience or whether it's a boss or whether it's a colleague or whether it's a mother or father or whether it's even a child, that if I could be who you need me to be, then I will be safe and then you will stick around and I will be successful in my business and I'll be successful in what I do. So, and I understand the risk of that, but I want you to speak just for 1 minute about the challenge of that and why that's a bad idea. I see. So it I see. That's really helpful. So, in effect, it's not that we're not listening or understanding their expectations. It's that we're not losing ourselves to those expectations. That, in effect, I could listen to you and I could, without being triggered, understand who you want me to be and what you want me to do. And then I am still the one who can make decisions in this particular situation at this particular time with this particular person. How do I want to show up based on what it is that I want to achieve, who I am, what the trade offs are? We are always in the power of making those decisions. But what you're saying is when we break out of that domestication, when we free our minds from being triggers to the needs and expectations of others, that we have the freedom of choice about how to act. And we can always choose to act in ways that serve us or serve them or serve the world, but we don't lose ourselves in the process. Right. Right. So you respect their independence and you respect your independence and you make choices. Right. And it's a very powerful vision. And what you're saying in the book and here is that there's guidance for ourselves as energy. And these are the four agreements that say if we want to really show up powerfully in the world as ourselves, undomesticated, with free energy, the way to do that is to follow these four agreements. And the first one you were beginning to share is to be impeccable with your word. Why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to be impeccable with our words? Right. So we have examples, millions of examples. That's the second agreement. How do we then distinguish between feedback that someone gives us that is personal, that they tell us something about ourselves that has a lot of truth to it and that's very personal and not about them, but it really about us, versus the feedback that they give us that's sloppy, that is really about them and has nothing to do with us? Hmm. Right? It almost doesn't matter if it's true or not. What matters is it's their perspective and it informs you about how to act with them so that you could be effective in that relationship, but it doesn't make you question who you are and whether, and create insecurities in you. Right. Yeah, right. I find also that people have tendencies that there are some people who won't believe, they won't take it personally if you criticize them, but they do take it personally if you compliment them. And on the other hand, people who don't take it personally if you compliment them, but do take it personally if you criticize them. And that also tells you something about yourself. So, by not taking things personally, we become more impeccable with our words and our actions also. Yes, absolutely. Talk to us, Miguel, if you would, about the third agreement. Don't make assumptions. So I was thinking about this, Miguel, and I was thinking one of the challenges of not making assumptions is that the very concept of an assumption is that we don't know that we're making it, that it's just something that happens. How do we uncover the assumptions that we make in a way that helps us to avoid making them? So how do we know what to believe then? Right? It's beautiful. Katie Byron, who's also on this podcast, talks about her four questions, and her second question is, how do I know it's true? And that seems like a very relevant question. If you say, I'm ugly or I'm weak, is it true? You might even say, yeah, I probably think it's true because you've been convinced, you've been domesticated. This is your belief system. Asking that next question, how do I know it's true? Helps you to begin to question that next assumption. Hmm. Uh, uh, you're saying you're saying something very interesting, which is as long as it's by definition unmaterial, a belief, it's never true. It's always a perception. So that if someone says you're ugly or you're weak or you're strong or you're beautiful, none of it matters because it's all a perception. Right. It's interesting, Miguel. So it's not about changing one belief for another. It's about letting go of all of those beliefs. Yeah, it's actually one of the hard things. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that words are insufficient. So just keeping that same analogy about, weak or strong or beautiful or ugly, that you can look at yourself and it's insufficient to come up with a word to describe yourself. So you just have a deep knowledge of who you are, but it's indescribable in that way. Beautiful. You're the fourth agreement, the last agreement, always do your best. Where are you located right now? So you're in San Diego. All right, and I'm in New York, and we're seeing each other. This is an audio interview only for the listeners, but Miguel and I are on Skype, looking at each other on a screen. It's interesting when I first read that agreement, I put the accent on best, but you're really putting the accent on do. Always do your best. That the accent is on action. This conversation makes me want to read the book again because there's a depth to this that and you mentioned this when we first started this conversation. You wrote it in a way that could appeal to everybody no matter what. When I first read the book, I read it, I think, on a more superficial level than I'm now understanding it. So it makes me want to read it again. Tell me how, as a writer, you're able to take this sort of deep Toltec wisdom, the years that you spent as an apprentice to your mother and in your family, and translate it. Especially when we're talking about opinions and words as not being the truth. How you're able to translate this into what turns out to be a very simple, easy to understand, well articulated book. These lessons are so simple and straightforward and um, immediately recognizable, and yet part of this conversation is how hard it is to live up to them, to be impeccable with the word, not to make assumptions. And I think what the book did for me is to remind me to say, and this conversation is doing for me also, to remind me to say, next assumption I make, I want to question it. Next time I say something, I want to pause briefly and say, am I being impeccable? Is this what I really mean? Um, right. I think it takes all of us slowing down just a little bit, because if we don't slow down, we'll follow the habits that we're in, and those habits lead us to be less than impeccable, or to not act on the things that are most important to act, or to make assumptions. And so that one of the lessons of this for me is to slow down enough and to just ask us, maybe spend a day, all day tomorrow, ask the first agreement, am I being impeccable with my word? Just one, and question whether I'm really doing that, and begin to see where there are lapses in my holding to that agreement. Right. It's scary. It's scary because the reason we're not impeccable with our word is because we don't want to have a reaction on the other side. We don't want to tell someone something. So it's very scary. And I think that's some of what we'll all feel when we do this, is we'll feel some of that fear. Right. Let's end on that beautiful image and vision. We have with us Don Miguel Ruiz. The Four Agreements is his book, a practical guide to personal freedom. Miguel, it is such a pleasure to have you on the Bregman Leadership Podcast. Thank you for joining us.